monsoons, wildfires, and so on. But back to regulations, the earthquake and other extreme event regulations, where they exist, differ between systems and across state lines. Some earthquake regulations deal with specific critical components, such as nuclear power plant stands, and etc. There are earthquake-related performance criteria. It's mostly limited to structural components, such as buildings, bridges, piers, or control towers, but there's relatively no system-level seismic performance criteria dealing with all services. Most systems are not designed for earthquakes or other extreme hazards, although some or many components might be. So this is an emphasis that resilience relates to. It's a system-level concept, and the components have to be built to develop a system that can be resilient, and how all of that interlinks. We'll get more into that. There's a variety of manuals and guidelines and standards for lifeline systems, but most don't address earthquakes or other extreme events. I refer you here to NIST 2016, which is the reference at the bottom of the slide. Those manuals, guidelines, and standards covering earthquakes are inconsistent within the systems, and especially across systems. Few address post-earthquake recovery times. Those that do or imply that they do are inconsistent. Lifelines generally are not designed to provide more reliable service to any specific customer. Aging and deterioration is a significant issue for all lifeline systems. An important aspect related to this presentation is that disaster resilience of a community is completely linked to the resilience of lifeline systems. Okay, so let's get into resilience a little bit more. I start with some community resilience definitions. There's a wide variety of them. I highlight the key terms in red here, but I'm just going to look at one of those. The one at the bottom, Presidential Policy Directive 21, which was published in 2013. They defined resilience as the ability to prepare for and adapt to changing conditions and to withstand and recover rapidly from disruption. Resilience includes the ability to withstand and recover from deliberate attacks, accidents, or naturally occurring threats or incidents. So this presentation is focusing on lifeline resilience. These definitions cover mostly at a community level or broader, like PPD 21 covers the nation. They're great for mobilizing large groups of people to create policy and move resilience forward at a community level, but it's difficult for Lifeline's organization to actually understand how to implement resilience within their system from these definitions. So based on that, I come up with a Lifeline infrastructure resilience definition that is going to be used as a basis throughout this presentation and many of the products that I've been able to help create. So a resilient lifeline infrastructure system is managed to provide safe and reliable services to customers or users, cope with chronic stressors, and accommodate hazard-related impacts with the ability to continue providing services or limit service outage times tolerable for community recovery efforts. This will be referred back to as we move forward in this presentation. So this definition is consistent with the above referenced community resilience definition. It has a strong emphasis on the services. That's a key component. So systems and services are key to understanding Lifeline resilience. So it has a strong emphasis on services provided by Lifeline infrastructure systems, helps Lifeline infrastructure organizations focus on operationalizing resilience into practice, and I'll give you some examples of that. Understands the damage to Lifeline infrastructure systems cannot always be prevented in large hazard strikes, meaning that we expect to lose services. It's almost impossible to design. In fact, if we weren't losing services, then we'd be trying to design a resistant system, not a resilient system. Right? The definition emphasizes service restorations needed to be accomplished based on local community resiliency, meaning the societal objectives, but it incorporates the need for continuing to maintain a system in good working order to ensure resilience across the spectrum of hazard types and magnitude. All right, so now let's talk a little bit more about Lifeline infrastructure resilience. It's the aggregate of many dimensions. Right? Resilience is the aggregate of many dimensions, whether it's community or lifeline specific. The infrastructure resilience focuses on a subset of dimensions related to built systems important for community resilience. In the absence of lifeline systems, community resilience is highly diminished. So to understand lifeline infrastructure resilience, we need to identify its domain. From that, we can then begin to answer the question of what is a resilient lifeline infrastructure system? And it's important to understand what it is and what characteristics it provides. So let me introduce to you a resilience model developed by the ASCE Infrastructure Resilience Division to better understand domains that we're talking about and which parameters help define the resilient lifeline system. So here we're going to talk about 3 dimensions as a primary, and then some that also support those 3 primary dimensions. So they include the system on the vertical axis, which are the same things that I described before, but also infrastructure includes buildings, but I'm not talking about buildings. I'll be talking about everything but buildings on this. But a lot of the things I do talk about could be implied to work with many building aspects. Okay, horizontally, we have hazards, and then coming out of the plane of the screen, we have the adverse event cycle. Then surrounding this, we have other dimensions that influence infrastructure resilience. So we have all hazards and multi-hazard perspectives. We have a lot of cross-cutting and external considerations on the right side of the screen, meaning dependencies and their relationships, post-event investigations, data, and so on, policy, social sciences, economics. And then we have some other dimensions on the bottom right, where we have the geographic dimensions, which are international, national, state, regional, and local. We have concepts of redundancy, rapidity, resourcefulness, robustness, mitigation, or adaptation, I mean. Mitigation also is an aspect. Then we have the project life cycle. Each of these dimensions makes, the 3 primary dimensions makes a cube, of which these other dimensions fit within that cube, right? So this cube shows flood, communication, and planning within this diagram. And then, of course, we have risk and uncertainty permeating throughout. So the cube I was referring to is here. All right, so moving on, let's talk a little bit about how we define the characteristics of resilient lifeline systems and then how they can be used. So characteristics are the attributes, features, qualities, and traits of a resilient lifeline system. We need to define these characteristics in order to truly understand what a resilient lifeline system is. So here, the following slides are extracted from a paper published in 2018. I will acknowledge my colleagues who helped me write this, Ali Mostafavi and Haesong Wong. And so you might refer to more detail in the paper if you're interested in the characteristics. So here I show again the 3 primary dimensions, the model from the ASCE. And what we want to do to understand the characteristics across all lifeline systems, we want to generalize this frame, this hazard system frame. And then once we do that, we generalize it and reestablish, keeping the same event cycle, we establish the primary dimensions that we want to look at is the resilience domain, which are the social, economic, technical, and organizational, and the resilience properties, which include redundancy, robustness, rapidity, and resourcefulness. So through that, we'll define the characteristics. The key characteristics will be presented in terms of the social, economic, technical, and organizational domain. And we've defined 17, actually 17 plus, because I'll actually give you an 18th. So 17 in the paper, plus 1 that I'll show has been more recently revealed, and I'll identify that for you. So the organizational characteristics are presented here. They read in this manner. So you start with the top underlying portion. A resilience lifeline system then you read the characteristics. So a resilient lifeline system has an organizational structure capable of cost-effectively managing, coordinating, and implementing core resilience activities in a safe and reliable manner, has organizational stability and capacity, has adequate support and resources to implement resilience measures, has plans for expected scenario events, including regional and local events, has or maintains emergency plans and exercises them consistent with the expected hazard scenario impact, has a commitment to continual development and improvement. So moving on to technical characteristics, a resilient lifeline system has established performance objectives and performance criteria, is aware of the hazards and threats, understands potential impacts to the system and its life cycle, and has established procedures to address them, identifies vulnerabilities and minimizes them in accordance with established performance objectives with short, intermediate, and long-term priorities, is able to measure and quantify resilience, develops post-event priorities on how to maintain services and methods to return lost services to different customers, has well-informed, highly capable incident management system, is able to enhance resilience through betterment processes during permanent repair of damaged facilities, is able to manage and help control cascading events. And then the social economic characteristics, a resilient lifeline system understands the direct and indirect social and economic impact that may result from a damaged system in its current and future state, is able to provide adequate and reliable post-incident emergency accessibility services throughout operational areas, has good communications with customers, community leadership within the service area and areas of operation and with other lifeline systems. And then the one that we've added, which would be number 18, has social and economic stability and capacity. This was added after looking at the hazard of COVID-19, which really addresses not the physical system, but the organizational part of the social technical system. So that also needs to be incorporated. So each characteristic is associated with achievement indicators. So all 18 have achievement indicators. The achievement indicators are linked to the resilient properties and event cycle, which are shown in this table on the right. This is just an example, but there are 119 achievement indicators that were published, actually 3 more with the 18th characteristic. So 122 achievement indicators at present. Each system can check to determine if they possess the characteristics and have implemented achievement indicators. And so I refer you back to the paper that I mentioned before for more detail on the achievement indicators. So I don't have time to go through all of those, and I don't want to spend your time here. So what this table shows at the top, this gives characteristic T1 that I described to you earlier. And then on the right, you see a series of columns for resilient properties and the event cycle. So you can use this as a lifeline organization to better understand where you're at as far as achieving these indicators and if you have these characteristics. So for example, you can go through and read these and check off, do we have these? In this particular example, there's a portion of characteristic T1. So they have achieved the indicator for performance objective, T1A and T1B, the identified service levels, so on and so forth. But they don't have C, D, E, and F, G, right? They're crossed off. And then further, you can see that each achievement indicator is linked to these performance properties with event cycles by the capital X on each side. And if you wanted to look to see and make improvements for resilience, for example, based on one of these resilience properties, in this case, redundancy, which I've circled, then you might actually want to see, well, which achievement indicators help me achieve redundancy in different levels. You could do the same thing for all the rest of the resilience properties in the event cycle. So then those could be used to operationalize resilience within your system. So you can use these characteristics and achievement indicators to identify gaps. The gaps can be used to develop the resilience program, which I'll summarize here real quick. and then incorporate the local hazard and lifeline specific resilience issue. All right, so let me explain that a little bit. So one, the characteristics and achievement indicators that I've listed are not intended to be comprehensive. Right? There could be others. As I identified, we found one more after publication, just by thinking about COVID-19 and how it affects lifeline systems. Plus, we generalize them across all lifeline systems, which inherently means that we cannot cover any locally specific lifeline resilience issues. Right? So locally, there always needs to be an addressing. So as an example, for the LA Department of Water and Power, their aqueduct crosses the San Andreas Fault. So there's some indicators that need to be addressed related to crossing of the San Andreas Fault and earthquake, specifically in fault rupture on that fault. So those would need to be thought about and added in. Then you would identify at the bottom, we have our target resilience characteristics, which are tabulated. And I gave you an example of the tabulation. You identify by those check boxes that I mentioned what you have that's existing and what you don't have, which would be these lines that are crossed off that you don't have, that don't have the check boxes. Those are your resilience gaps, right? Those can be used as a basis for creating a resilience program, which would be implemented here. So first we identify the resilience characteristics and achievement indicators, identify the gaps, which are in the upper right. Those feed into this circular never-ending process, right? So from those gaps, you can develop a program, prioritize the improvements that need to be made, integrate those into your planning, design, emergency response, maintenance, and operation, translate to capital improvement program. And once some of those are implemented, then you take a look at what else you need and just continually identify this. Plus, in this cycle that we show here with the arrows, you can also identify, you get some feedback, you might identify additional characteristics by thinking through the process and additional achievement indicators that might need to be made. So this is how you can implement the process. This has been published. There's an example in the paper, the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power. This is the process to create their resilience program, which is set into policy at the LA water system. Okay, so now I want to move forward and present to you a framework for engineering resilient lifeline systems. Okay, so this framework that I'm about to present to you is developed by the ASCE Infrastructure Resilience Division jointly with the Japan Society of Civil Engineers. So it's intended to be an international framework, useful around the world, not just in the United States, not just local. So it addresses analysis, management, and governance. It intends to cover the infrastructure domain previously described, help direct research, development, and implementation, clarify the role of infrastructure systems within a broader community resilience, and incorporate the 17 plus, right, 18 that I just mentioned, characteristics of resilient lifeline systems. So here's a complicated diagram that I'll briefly describe to you, outlining this framework. Okay, so what we have at the top is system assessment. So we have system assessment. Trying to get a pointer out for you. Okay, so we have system assessment at the top. We have a legend. This diagram shows processes, tools, and outcomes. It is cut in half across the middle. We have a horizontal line because below that, then we have management and governance. So the gray lines cover the flow for the processes, which are described in these tan-ish colored boxes. And there are 8 elements that I will describe to you. Then there are tools, which are in blue, and outcomes, which are in green. The blue arrows describe the flow for the management and governance parts of the process. So the first element, element 1, is the infrastructure resilience domain. I've already described that. But from that, we have our hazards, our systems, and the event cycle, which lead to supporting element 2, which is the lifeline system performance or functionality. So we're talking about the organizational and technical, meaning the social technical domain. Then we have, through that, we identify the functionality, which I'll describe more later. It incorporates the hazard strike, the loss of function. It incorporates the dependencies and interdependencies. That feeds to elements 3 and 4. Element 3 is the system service provision and operability, shown by this diagram up here pictorially. And element 4 is the continuity of services temporarily lost because you lose functionality. Right? So these two run in parallel, and both of those feed into social and economic activity, element 5. And then that leads to element 6, which is the community and its well-being. So here, elements 5 and 6 represent the core community resilience elements, and elements 2, 3, and 4 together represent the core infrastructure resilience elements. I'm sorry, elements 4. So that's correct. Elements 2, 3, and 4 represent the community resilience elements. The elements 4, 5, and 6 represent the core community resilience. Right. So we have the core infrastructure resilience elements and the core community resilience elements here. So the overlap is element 4, which is the continuity of services, where that has to be well coordinated, and I'll describe that a little bit later if I have time. Then we have element 7, feeding from elements 5 and 6, which is now in the management and governance, which is to establish community performance targets, which leads to element 8, which is to define the infrastructure system performance targets based on the community performance targets. Then that leads to a comparison that's needed between elements 2, 3, and 4 with element 8. Right? And that feeds back into the analysis. And so you would do an analysis of your system, see if it meets what the community needs, and does the community actually meet the performance that it intends to have. And if it does, then you're good. If it doesn't, then things need to be modified in a systematic manner, never-ending continuous process, and maintaining those elements that you have, or the parts of the elements for resilience, and improving the characteristics that you need, so that you can further develop and improve infrastructure resilience to support the community resilience. Now, there's also the outcomes, right, of these processes, which include policy that's needed, social and economic losses, and economics of resilience. So I'm going to focus mostly on elements 2, 3, and 4 at this point. Sorry, I can't move forward without the attention. I got to get rid of it. Okay, so sorry for the pause. So let's look a little bit closer at the core infrastructure elements. I've already gone through element 1. I'm now going to go through element 2, which is functionality, and 3, operability, kind of together because they're highly interrelated. And then I'll bring forward some parts of element 4. So let's look at functionality and operability elements of infrastructure resilience, elements 2 and 3. I refer you here to more detail that you can get on this in a paper that has recently been released. It won't be formally published until 2021, but it's titled Understanding Functionality and Operability for Infrastructure System Resilience. It's actually currently available online. If you look up the Natural Hazards Review, you can find that in its current, it will be in the next release, which will be in February. So what we need to do is measure Lifeline system resilience by looking at functionality and operability. So to understand infrastructure resilience, there's a need to measure the performance and reliability of the entire infrastructure system, serving its intended purpose at or as close as possible to the level it did prior to the event. This is basically looking at the percentage of the infrastructure system working at pre-event levels. This is functionality, which is element 2 of the framework. So a simpler way to think about it is we're looking at the amount of damage in system restoration through repairs and reconstruction. We also need to measure the operational level that provides infrastructure services adequate to allow social institutions to perform their functions. This is the percentage of users receiving the custom pre-event services from the infrastructure system. This is operability, or element 3. So it can also be simplified by thinking about it as we're looking at the loss and restoration of services provided by the system. So here's a conceptual diagram where we can understand the differences in the visual form between functionality and operability. So in this diagram, we have some pre-event normal operating level. So 100% of the services, for example, or close to it, being provided at any given time. We have an earthquake event or any other type of extreme hazard event, and we lose functionality right along this gray line. Okay, so we lose functionality to some level, in this case to about 35%, and then we begin to restore it over time. And when we lose functionality, we also lose potentially the ability to provide services, right? So we're losing some form of operability. But just because you have damage to a component or a portion of the system doesn't mean that you necessarily lose services or all of the services equivalent to the level of functionality. So down here we have a time to restore operability and a time to restore functionality. Functionality and operability are continuous measures, and full functionality and full operability occur at a specific state. In common practice, usually only one of these measures is presented, not both, and it's termed functionality, creating a confusion. So sometimes people actually are referring to operability, but they still call it functionality. They're looking at the services provided rather than the damage, and that causes confusion. So we need both to measure and properly understand infrastructure resilience, and we need to use proper terminology so that we can communicate properly to each other. All right, so to do that, I propose different definitions for functionality and operability in a resilience context. So functionality is proposed to be defined as the quality or state of working properly to provide a regular, reliable service at or as close as possible to what the infrastructure system provided prior to the event. And operability is the fitness, capacity, or ability to use to provide basic services, allowing customers or users to receive normal or near normal amenities from the potentially impaired infrastructure system. Okay, so there's a need to clearly delineate the differences in time to restore basic services versus the time to make all system repairs, because these are not necessarily equivalent. And also I want to point out that the green font used in these two definitions is really the definition from Webster's, and the black font is putting these two definitions in a resilience context. Right? So now let's look a little bit deeper into understanding functionality. It's the most commonly used metric for describing infrastructure system resilience, and I show two diagrams. One of them identifying that functionality is lessened through deterioration, which is occurring continuously throughout each of these systems, right? So we have at any given day, every day, a certain part of functionality is lost just simply due to deterioration. So we have that. We're showing that in the diagram on the left. We have the event that I mentioned earlier. We lose a certain level of functionality, then it's restored to something that is equivalent, which is to the trend prior to the event, which is R2. Maybe something less if you can't quite get it back up to. Maybe you don't have enough money or the ability to get it there. So maybe it's at R3 or something greater than what it was before, which would be R1. Basically, the curve on the right is normalizing for deterioration, and it's actually easier to follow, in my opinion. So I just show that it's deterioration exists, but it's being normalized for that. Then we further understand functionality by understanding that it incorporates robustness, which is the capacity to minimize the initial losses, then the function of the system and its components pre-event. It's also a function of the systems and its pre-event condition, right? So it includes resistance to damage and redundancy. Functionality also incorporates rapidity, which is the time to recover. So how fast can you recover? How rapidly can you recover? It incorporates the dependencies and interdependencies. It incorporates secondary losses from cascading effects like dam failure, fire, and so on. Time to recovery is a result of the planning, preparedness, response, recovery, and rebuild capabilities and capacity. It's strongly associated with available resources that can be used in emergency and crisis management competencies. Functionality and operability. Now that we know that about functionality, we need to understand that functionality is a measure of system resilience, the system resilience, infrastructure system. Operability is a measure of how the system supports community resilience, which I'm going to go through in the next few slides. Both measures are needed to support the infrastructure resilience definition that I provided earlier. So let's dig a little bit deeper into the concept of operability. So to understand operability, we need to classify the basic service categories the infrastructure system must provide in a disaster. The basic services are those adequate to allow customers and users to proceed with or resume activities in a relatively normal manner in relation to those amenities. To accomplish the basic services, the accomplishment of basic services through the network defines system operability. I'll show you some diagrams of this. The system is considered to have 100% operability when all the basic services are provided throughout the infrastructure system service areas. A system can have a reduced operability by loss of dependent services, even if it is not damaged. So remember, I showed you can have a loss of functionality. You can also have a loss of operability. And the time to restore operability is always less than or equal to the time to restore functionality. Okay, so we can define basic service categories. So here I show these definitions for each Lifeline system, which is in the left column. And then on the right, we show the basic service categories of delivery, collection, connectivity, quantity, quality, duration, disposal, fire protection, protective barrier, and emergency. So where there's an X, the Lifeline system has those basic services. So water has the basic services for of delivery, quantity, quality, and fire protection, and so on. There's a lot more to this that I don't have time to describe, but I want to present to you that these are there. Then we can define each of these, which I'm not going to go through each definition, right? But we can define each of these basic service categories. So the service categories that are on the top row are now in the left column with a summary description of each. So as one example, delivery for water, the system can distribute product to the customers, right? The delivery includes more than just water, right? Delivery includes for electric power and gas and liquid fuels, right? So they deliver the product, right? So it's those as definitions. I'll go through a description of how they're used. So here's a conceptual representation of the basic service categories, which are identified as BSC by its acronym, and operability. So I'm showing the same, but a cut portion of the earlier curve where I defined functionality and operability early on in this discussion. And I show full operability, but for scaling, I cut off the right part of it. I just cut it out. The functionality doesn't get the full functionality in this diagram because I've cut it off. It does trend up, as I showed to pre-event levels. But then I'm showing also 4 basic service categories. So think of this as the water system of the 4 basic service categories that I defined. So let's think, for example, BSC might be water delivery, right? So we lose a certain amount of customers with delivery, and then eventually they get restored with delivery. Water quality, the same, water quantity, and fire protection. So BSC 1 through 4 would be identified by these dashed lines. So operability is the accomplishment of all of them. So it basically bounds them. I show this with a smooth curve. However, technically it should be a little bit more jagged and follow just the outer bound of these 4 curves. Right? So then here's an example that these are real. These can be measured. This is the 4 basic service category losses and restoration for the Los Angeles water system through the 1994 Northridge earthquake. So we have water delivery, quantity, quality, and fire protection. In this particular case, operability, which is shown in the black smooth curve, is bound by quality. However, as I showed earlier, That happens to be the case in that particular earthquake event. But they don't necessarily, operability is not necessarily driven by one particular basic service category. I also show functionality on here, which doesn't quite match, right? So it overlaps in this measurement because it's using a different metric than I use for the quantity, quality, the basic service categories. But in theory, if we use common metrics, they would not overlap. All right, so now I'm going to move forward to identifying a new concept of functional recovery that's being driven by the federal government. So this comes in a report that is soon to be released titled Recommended Options for Improving the Built Environment for Post-Earthquake Reactivity and Functional Recovery Time, developed by NIST and FEMA, which are the National Institute of Standards and Technology and the Federal Emergency Management Agency, as directed by Congress. So the basis of the report comes from the reauthorization in 2018 of the National Earthquake Hazard Reduction Program, where Congress asked FEMA and NIST to assess and recommend options for improving the built environment and critical infrastructure to reflect performance goals stated in terms of post-earthquake reoccupancy, which is for buildings, and functional recovery time, which is for buildings and lifeline systems. So for sake of time, I'm not going to describe reoccupancy, but it does apply to the buildings that make up components of the lifeline system. But I will describe to you functional recovery defined as a post-earthquake performance state in which a building or lifeline infrastructure system is maintained or restored to safely and adequately support the basic intended functions associated with the pre-earthquake use or occupancy of a building or the pre-earthquake service level of a lifeline infrastructure system. So functional recovery is a performance state, not a continuous function, a performance state when basic services are restored, i.e. that is, users receive services essentially as prior to an earthquake and can understand their activities relatively normal with respect to these services. Right? So if we go back to this same diagram, I'm showing that I showed earlier. I showed a portion of this to define the basic service categories, but I'm showing here full functionality as a final performance state on the far right at the top. Full operability is a performance state when operability is completed in the middle, and functional recovery is basically the same by its definition as full operability, right? So full operability and functional recovery in this description are the same. So functional recovery is not a continuous function, it's just a point in time at which you've met a certain state of recovery. Okay, now let's move quickly to continuity of services for the element 4 of the infrastructure framework. Okay, so continuity of services, resilient communities have the capacity to manage without basic services during a certain time the lifeline network cannot provide them. So think of water and water loss, or gas and gas loss, or electric power with electric service lines. You can still get by for a certain period of time, but at some point it doesn't work out, right? So the resilient lifeline systems need to accommodate the basic service losses and restore them to the community when they're needed, right? But before the system is restoring all of these, some type of continuity needs to take place. So for water, it would be a bottle of water, right? So this diagram is just showing how, as an example, how different potable water services like bottled water or other methods could be supplied to customers while the network cannot provide them, right? So portable toilets, alternate transportation routes, emergency shelters, emergency fuel, and so on. So the continuity of services can be achieved in different ways. So two primary ways would be through the provision of emergency alternative services independent of or in collaboration with the lifeline system, or through system modification to provide limited services until the network basic services are restored. So I referred to emergency alternative services. In the second primary bullet, we describe what they are. Emergency alternative services are those which can be obtained to supplement the lack of services provided through um, bottled water, power generators, and so on, portable toilets, as I described earlier in the diagram. So the coordination of emergency alternative services requires transparency on the system Lifeline's capability, the Lifeline system capability. Allows social institutions to properly plan for these conditions. If they know what they don't have the capability to receive over a period of time, then they can plan for them. And it helps reduce the possibility of inadequate and untimely support services for plausible events. Element 4, as I mentioned earlier, is a key crossover link between the infrastructure system and community resilience, filling the basic service gaps to ensure all the needs are met. Functional recovery of a building may be achieved by using emergency alternative services like electric power generators built in. And this is a critical and often overlooked component of Lifeline system resilience. You can't claim that you have a resilient system if you're not really addressing it. All right, so let me quickly go through performance targets and performance-based design. So the Lifeline system performance targets are needed to establish, by the definitions I gave earlier, to limit service outage times tolerable to community recovery efforts. This can't randomly happen. There has to be targets of which both the system is shooting for and the community can rely upon. So this is based on community performance targets, if they exist, and a broader regional, social, economic goals. However, if the community does not have targets, the Lifeline system should still develop targets and let the communities know what those targets are. So the fact that a community isn't trying to undertake a resilience program does not prevent the Lifeline system from implementing targets and moving forward in the resilience program. However, there is a need to establish common criteria consistent across the nation so that everybody can do this in a uniform manner. The targets can be established for basic service categories or for broader resilience service requirements, meaning that you can simplify it and just look at full system recovery and full functionality. I'm going to, for sake of time, I'm going to skip the rest of this on performance-based design. Just wanted to emphasize that we need performance targets and just move into the summary. So in summary, what is infrastructure resilience? It's a system level concept. Infrastructure resilience is defined from the loss of services and the ability to restore them following an event based on user needs. It's multidimensional. The focus is around 3 dimensions: the system, the hazard, and the event cycle. It's not independent of the broader community resilience. So you can't claim resilience of a system only by the system. You have to look at the people that are being served by the system. It has 17 or more characteristics. That's shown you 18. It's measured using functionality and operability. Full functionality is achieved functional recovery is achieved at full operability, as mentioned earlier, as a new concept. It includes continuity of services to customers when the system cannot provide them. Also, in summary, let's talk about how it's implemented. How is infrastructure system resilience implemented? It's implemented using continuous processes. It's implemented developing infrastructure resilience programs by creating resilience plans, undertaking programs and plans achieving the 119, or now I'd say 123 achievement indicators, engineered using defined recovery performance targets, accomplished it's by accomplishing social and economic outcomes consistent with the communities that are being served, by employing good resilience policies, and using proper management and governance. And then lastly, I want to point out where future work is needed. This is not a complete or comprehensive list. I'm just listing some high priorities that are currently or should be worked on. So functionality needs to be measured using social and technical metrics. Normally it's only addressed using technical metrics. Measuring functionality and operability using consistent metrics. I gave you an example of where it can be confusing if you're not using consistent metrics. We need a framework defining consistent service goals for all buildings and Lifeline systems. The maximum basic service losses and restoration times for emergency response phase need to be addressed. Advanced evaluation and methods incorporating all subsystems, dependencies, and interdependencies, basic service categories need to be developed. Guidelines and standards incorporating recovery objectives need to be developed. And there's a lot more. I give references here to NIST 2014 and 2016 that cover them to a much greater degree. And then lastly, I want to point out that we are organizing a 50-year anniversary conference for the San Fernando earthquake around Lifeline. This is called Lifeline's 2021, now 2021-22. It was scheduled for February 7th through 10th in 2021, but due to COVID-19, we had to move it out a year. It is now scheduled for February, the in-person gathering will be February 7th through 11th in 2022. We will actually kick off this conference with activities on February 9th, 2021, which is the anniversary of the San Fernando earthquake, which struck Los Angeles nearly 50 years ago. It is the basis and reason why we actually address Lifeline systems. It is the event that made us understand that we need to address Lifeline systems, which was incorporated into ASCE, first through the Technical Council on Lifeline Approach Engineering, but now through the ASCE Infrastructure Resilience Division. I encourage you to look at our website at lifelines2021.ucla.edu. This conference is co-organized through ASCE Infrastructure Resilience Division and UCLA. It will be held in person at UCLA. I also encourage you to join the local the local organizing committee. You can get a hold of Ruanka Parsenge or Paul Lee, who are helping to coordinate the local organizing committee. And you can find information for that on the InLab website. With that, I will stop my presentation and give this back to Amit.
Thank you, Craig, for such a wonderful presentation. I really appreciate it. And that was like a lot of information which was shared, and it was a great presentation. I have a few questions. I know we are like right on the dot, but we have a few questions. Maybe you can answer them for next few minutes.
Sure.
Let me just check the questions in the chat section. So, yeah, the first question is, like, sometimes an enhanced level of functionality is to be considered after an incident or an event that comprises operations and function. And in your model, you presented it as R1 better than old. So what drivers are involved in classifying R1 versus R2?
Well, one, if you put in more robust components, right? So if you have damage because you had a vulnerable component, and that resulted in loss of services, then if you put in a more robust or less vulnerable component after the event, then you would have greater functionality. If you've added redundancies because you know where you have some vulnerabilities, and if you just add a redundancy, then you would have greater functionality. Remember, functionality is a function of the organization itself. So if you've improved your management skills and your emergency response and recovery capabilities, you would actually have greater functionality. Some of these are not completely measurable at the moment, like the functionality curve I showed for LADWP did not incorporate the organizational aspect, but that's just some of the examples of how you would achieve functionality above what you had prior to the event.
Okay. Yeah, thank you, Craig. I have another question. Has ASCE resilience model or process been readily adopted by agencies other than DWP? like then what are the biggest barriers in implementing these processes in your experience? Are there any of these inventories available for viewing online or accessible? So
Okay.
has this process been adopted by any other agencies than DWP? That's the first question.
Yeah. So in parts, not in whole. Um, so different organizations are looking at this in different ways, and you don't have to adopt it in the whole to improve resilience. But if you just start adopting parts of it, you're making improvements, but you can't achieve the ultimate goal of your best resilience, if you will, without adopting it as a whole. But that takes a lot of time and effort, and it's continuous time and effort. And even things that people have now, um, if you don't keep track of what you have as a resilience characteristic or achievement indicator over time, you can actually lose some of those. Like you might quit training your incoming staff, and then you would lose uh, um, resilience characteristics, right? By that. So keep that in mind. Maintaining these as well as adopting them are really important. So the hope is that a lot of people would. Are what other? There were three parts to that question. That can you
Yeah.
help me?
So the second part is like, what are the biggest barriers in implementing these processes in your experience?
Yes. Okay, good. I'm glad you qualified in my experience because that's the way I would have to qualify it. One is getting people to understand the difference between resilience and sustainability. These are not the same. They do have overlaps and commonalities, and they have tremendous differences. And my first barrier was convincing. So I've gotten a lot of this set into policy at the LA Department of Water and Power. And so, speaking from that experience and working with a lot of organizations across the city of Los Angeles, which is pretty big, my first barrier was always, well, we're doing this. We have a sustainability program. No, it's not the same. And your sustainability program is not necessarily addressing disasters. And even if it is, if you're not specifically looking at resilience, your sustainability program is insufficient to address everything that I talked about here. I would suggest that everything I talked about here has nothing to do with what would be in a sustainability program. So that's the first thing. The second one is I'm not going to do it because I can't afford it. So you got to get over the fact that it might cost something. I can give you well over 100 examples of where I've saved literally in the hundreds of millions of dollars to the Los Angeles Department of Water and Power by implementing resilience concepts. So some things cost a lot of money. Some things don't cost anything. And some things actually save a lot of money. And just getting your preparedness program, which is essential for everything, even COVID-19, is the most cost-effective thing that you could do, and to implement all of these things, to study it, keep it updated, make sure people are trained. That's the least expensive thing that you could do to be resilient. But having a good emergency response program does not make you resilient. It's a necessary component to be resilient. And I don't know if I've covered the third part of that question or if we should move on, but I'll leave that up to you in this.
Yeah, sorry, I was on mute. The last part was like, are any of these inventories available for viewing online?
ASCE Infrastructure Resilience Division doesn't have the ability, unfortunately, to put these on the IRD website. But there are ways to look at it. I think that some of these things are a little bit new. But there are papers that you could download. I gave references to those. Those can be found online. Contact me directly if you wanted some of those references, and I can provide those to you. And hopefully over time, these will become more available online in standard forms of which you could begin to utilize.
Yeah, thank you, Craig. I think we are almost about time, and I don't see any more questions. But thank you everyone for all your questions and attending the presentation. And thank you, Craig. This was like a really great presentation, and we got to know a lot about Lifeline's infrastructure resiliency. I really appreciate you taking your time and presenting to us today. So if you guys have any questions for Craig, you can email them to me and I will forward them to Craig. Or if you have any in general questions, please feel free to email me at my email address, which is shown on the screen. So yeah, with this, we conclude our today's presentation, and stay tuned. We will have another presentation coming up in a month or two. Thank you.